A library card? That's all you've got for ID? The snickers echoed through the marble halls of the prestigious Whitmore University Library until she placed it on the scanner. Nice artwork, one graduate student mocked. Did you get that from a cereal box? Another whispered. Public library card. How fitting for someone who clearly doesn't belong here. A third leaned over, voice dripping with condescension. Maybe she thinks this is the community center. When the scanner's blue light hit the embedded chip, time stopped. The holographic emblem that materialized wasn't from any public library. It was classified. Level 7. The librarian's hand trembled as she stared at the screen. The code that was supposed to have been deactivated 15 years ago. The access level that officially didn't exist. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from Hidden Valor, where true service is never forgotten, even when the world tries to erase it. The morning mist clung to the Gothic spires of Whitmore University as students hurried across the cobblestone paths, their designer backpacks and pristine notebooks marking them as members of academia's elite. The Whitmore Memorial Library stood like a cathedral of knowledge, its stained glass windows depicting great scholars and thinkers throughout history. Inside, the silence was reverent, broken only by the soft whisper of turning pages and the gentle hum of climate control systems, protecting millions of dollars worth of rare manuscripts. Elena Vasquez stood at the information desk, her weathered hands clutching a simple plastic library card. At 42, she looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a plain navy jacket over well-worn jeans. The kind of clothes that spoke of careful budgeting and practical choices. Around her, students in expensive athleisure and professors in tailored blazers moved with the confident ease of those who belonged. She didn't. The head librarian, Dr. Margaret Thornfield, looked up from her computer with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to dealing with the public. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her silk blouse probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. Behind her, the circulation desk gleamed with polished mahogany and brass fixtures that had been there since the library's founding in 1887. I'm looking for access to the military archives section, Elena said quietly. I need to research some historical records for a project I'm working on. Dr. Thornfield's smile faltered slightly. She glanced at Elena's appearance, taking in the simple clothes and the slightly nervous demeanor. The military archives are restricted access, dear. They're primarily for faculty research and graduate students working on approved dissertations. Elena nodded toward the signs posted around the desk. But it says here that community members can access special collections with proper identification and credentials. She held up her library card. This should be sufficient. A group of graduate students working nearby looked up from their laptops. One of them, a young man with perfectly styled hair and a Georgetown University sweatshirt, nudged his companion. Another one, he whispered, just loud enough to be heard. They come in here thinking a library card gets them into everything. Dr. Thornfield took the card with reluctance. I'm sure you understand that our military collection contains sensitive historical documents. We have to be very careful about who we grant access to. The liability alone. She trailed off, her implication clear. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I understand the sensitivity. I wouldn't be asking if it weren't important. Dr. Thornfield sighed and walked over to the card scanner, a sophisticated piece of equipment that looked more like it belonged in a government facility than a library. The scanning bed was equipped with multiple sensors and cameras, designed to read everything from magnetic strips to embedded chips to biometric data. As she placed Elena's card on the scanner, the graduate students continued their commentary. Nice artwork, the Georgetown student said, peering over at the simple design on Elena's card. Did you get that from a cereal box? His companion, a young woman with designer glasses, giggled softly. Public library card. How fitting for someone who clearly doesn't belong here. A third student, this one wearing a Princeton hoodie that probably cost more than Elena's monthly grocery budget, leaned over with a smirk. Maybe she thinks this is the community center. The laughter that followed was polite but cruel, the kind that came from people who had never been denied access to anything in their lives. Elena stood perfectly still, her face expressionless. She'd heard worse, much worse. But something in her eyes hardened, a flash of steel that none of them noticed. Dr. Thornfield was too focused on the scanner to see it, and the students were too busy congratulating themselves on their wit to pay attention to the woman they were mocking. The scanner hummed to life, its blue light passing over Elena's card. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered. Data began cascading across the display, but it wasn't the usual library patron information. Lines of code flashed by, too fast for Dr. Thornfield to read. The scanner's hum grew louder, and suddenly the room's lighting dimmed as the system drew more power. What's happening? Dr. Thornfield muttered, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The scanner was accessing databases she didn't even know existed. Security protocols she'd never seen before were activating. The screen went black for a moment, then blazed to life, with a holographic display that materialized 6 inches above the scanner bed. The emblem that appeared was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. It wasn't flat like a normal image, but three-dimensional, rotating slowly in the air. The seal was intricate, featuring an eagle with spread wings, surrounded by stars and symbols that seemed to shift and change as it turned. But it was the text that made Dr. Thornfield's blood run cold. Classified, Level 7 Access Deep Water Clearance, Active Authorization. Vasquez. Elena M. Operational Status. Inactive Security Clearance. Sumasa. The Georgetown student's smirk faded. The woman with designer glasses stopped giggling. The Princeton student took a step back, suddenly very interested in his textbook. The holographic display pulsed gently, and additional information began appearing in smaller text below the main. Emblem. Service Branch. Naval Intelligence Unit. Task Force 6-1. Classified. Specialization. Deep Cover Operations Commendations. Redacted. Combat Deployments. Redacted. Security Clearance Level. Higher than most GNER LSDR. Thornfield's hands shook as she reached for the phone. This wasn't possible. Level 7 clearance was a myth, something that existed only in conspiracy theories and bad movies. And cosmic security clearance? That was so far above her pay grade that she'd never even heard of it outside of spy novels. The holographic emblem continued to rotate, and now additional security features were becoming visible. Microtext that appeared and disappeared. Biometric scanners that were somehow reading Elena's vital signs through the air. Authentication codes that changed every few seconds. This wasn't just a library card. This was a piece of technology that belonged in the Pentagon, not in a university library. Elena watched the display with the same calm expression she'd worn while being mocked. But now the steel in her eyes was more apparent, and her posture had subtly shifted. The tired, middle-aged woman was still there, but underneath was something else. Something that moved with predatory grace and watched everything with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years in places where a moment's inattention could mean death. Ma single quotes am. Dr. Thornfield said, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm going to need to make a phone call. The holographic display flickered once more, and then new text appeared. Security Protocol Alpha 7 initiated. Verification complete. Access granted to all restricted materials. The graduate students who had been making jokes just moments before now stood frozen. The Georgetown student's expensive sweatshirt suddenly seemed like a child's costume. The woman with designer glasses was staring at Elena like she was seeing a ghost. And the Princeton student had gone pale, finally understanding that he'd just mocked someone who could probably have him disappeared with a single phone call. Elena's voice, when she finally spoke, was perfectly calm. "I'll wait here while you make your call, Dr. Thornfield, and I'll still need access to those military archives." The holographic emblem pulsed once more, casting eerie shadows across the faces of everyone in the immediate area. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the quiet hum of the scanner and the sound of Elena's steady breathing. But the damage was done. Word was already spreading through the library like wildfire. Students were whispering into their phones. Faculty members were emerging from their offices to see what the commotion was about. And in the distance, the sound of rapid footsteps suggested that security was already on its way. Elena Vasquez stood perfectly still in the center of the growing storm, her simple library card still lying on the scanner bed. The tired woman in the navy jacket was gone, replaced by someone who had clearly spent years in places where currency and trust was a luxury that could get you killed. The most exclusive library in the state had just discovered that they had been judging someone by the wrong cover entirely. And as Dr. Thornfield's trembling fingers dialed a number that would connect her directly to a very surprised government official, Elena allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The real show was just beginning. The whispers started in the periodicals section and spread like wildfire through the study carrels. By the time Elena had been standing at the circulation desk for 5 minutes, half the library knew that something unprecedented was happening. Students pretended to study while stealing glances at the woman who had somehow made the most sophisticated security system in the building treat her like visiting royalty. Elena Vasquez had grown accustomed to being invisible. For the past 3 years, she'd been working the overnight shift at Mercy General Hospital, mopping floors and emptying trash cans in the cardiac wing. The pay was barely enough to cover her rent on the studio apartment in the Riverside district, where gunshots were more common than garbage collection. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet woman in 4B, who kept to herself and never complained about the broken elevator or the heating that worked sporadically at best. She'd moved to the city after her discharge, drawn by the promise of anonymity that only a place like Chicago could provide. No one asked questions in the Riverside district. No one cared about your past as long as you paid your rent on time and didn't cause trouble. Elena had been perfectly content to blend into the background, to be just another face in the crowd of people, trying to rebuild their lives one day at a time. But anonymity was a luxury she'd never been able to fully afford. Even in civilian clothes, even with her military bearing carefully suppressed, there were tells. The way she automatically positioned herself with her back to a wall, the manner in which her eyes constantly scanned for exits, the unconscious habit of cataloging potential threats in every room she entered. Most people didn't notice these things, but Elena had learned that the world was full of people who noticed everything. Her morning routine was precise and unchanging. Up at 5:00 hours, though she'd trained herself to think of it as 5 in the morning. Coffee, black, no sugar. The same brand she'd been drinking for 15 years, because it was available on every military base and in every war zone she'd ever been stationed in. 20 minutes of calisthenics in the cramped space between her bed and the kitchenette. Shower, exactly 4 minutes, a habit formed during years of water rationing in places where clean water was more precious than ammunition. Then came the hardest part of her day, the walk to the bus stop. Not because of the physical exertion, but because it required her to venture into the world as Elena Vasquez, tired hospital worker, rather than the person she'd been for 20 years. The transformation was subtle but complete. Her shoulders would relax slightly. Her stride would become less precise. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in a dozen different countries would dial down to a level that wouldn't make her stand out in a crowd. The bus ride to Whitmore University took 43 minutes, including transfers. Elena used the Time to review the notes she'd compiled over the past 6 months. Not the kind of notes a hospital janitor would typically keep, but detailed intelligence reports on a pattern she'd noticed in the cardiac wing. Patients were dying at a rate that didn't match the statistical models. The deaths were being attributed to natural causes, but Elena's trained eye had spotted inconsistencies that the medical staff had missed. She'd tried to bring her concerns to the hospital administration, but a night shift janitor's observations weren't exactly taken seriously. The head of cardiology had listened to her with the kind of patronizing patience usually reserved for children and elderly relatives. Her supervisor had suggested she focus on her cleaning duties and leave the medical analysis to the professionals. Elena couldn't let it go. During her 20-year career with naval intelligence, she'd learned to recognize patterns that others missed. The skill that had made her invaluable in places like Afghanistan, Syria, and half a dozen other locations that didn't officially exist on any mission reports. The same instincts that had kept her alive through operations that had claimed the lives of better-trained operatives. The trail had led her to Whitmore University's military archives, where she hoped to find historical precedents for the pattern she'd identified. Similar clusters of unexplained deaths in military hospitals during wartime. Cases where medical personnel had been compromised by enemy agents. Incidents that had been classified and buried in archives that most people didn't even know existed. But accessing those archives required credentials that Elena Vasquez, hospital janitor, didn't possess, which was why she'd been forced to use the library card that she'd hoped never to touch again. The card itself was unremarkable. Plain white plastic with a magnetic strip and a simple barcode. But embedded within the innocent-looking rectangle was technology that most people couldn't even imagine. A quantum-encrypted chip that contained her entire service record, complete with security clearances that exceeded those of most cabinet members. Biometric scanners that could identify her from across a room. Communication protocols that could reach into the deepest levels of government with a single scan. Elena had been given the card during her final debriefing, 3 years ago in a windowless room buried beneath the Pentagon. The man who'd handed it to her had been vague about its purpose, mentioning something about continued access to information that might be relevant to her transition to civilian life. She'd tucked it into her wallet and tried to forget about it, hoping that her time in the shadows was finally over. But some shadows, Elena had learned, were deeper than others. The call Dr. Thornfield was making had connected her to a secure line that bounced through 3 different government agencies before reaching the desk of someone who had been waiting for this moment for almost 3 years. The phone had barely finished its first ring when a crisp voice answered. Oversight Division, this is Director Matthews. Dr. Thornfield at Whitmore University Library. I have a situation here. Someone just scanned a library card that triggered some kind of classified security protocol. There was a pause. Can you describe the individual who scanned the card? Hispanic woman, early 40s, about 5'6". Dark hair, wearing civilian clothes. She was asking about access to our military archives. Another pause, longer this time. Dr. Thornfield, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The person you're dealing with is a former federal agent with the highest possible security clearance. Whatever she's requesting, you need to provide it immediately. And I need you to treat her with the utmost respect and discretion. But sir, our protocols are superseded by federal authority. Dr. Thornfield, this individual has served her country in ways that I cannot discuss over an unsecured line. She's earned whatever access she's requesting, and frankly, we're all lucky that she's chosen to go through proper channels. Dr. Thornfield's hand trembled as she hung up the phone. She looked across the desk at Elena, who was still standing with the same calm patience she displayed throughout the entire ordeal. The graduate students who had been making jokes were now clustered near the reference section, whispering among themselves and shooting nervous glances in Elena's direction. Ms. Vasquez, Dr. Thornfield said, her voice carefully controlled. I apologize for the delay. I've been authorized to provide you with full access to our military archives. If you'll follow me, I'll escort you to the restricted collections personally. Elena nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and the fact that she'd expected nothing less. Thank you, Dr. Thornfield. I appreciate your assistance. As they walked through the library's main hall, Elena was aware of the attention she was attracting. Students and faculty members who had been absorbed in their work were now stealing glances at the woman who had somehow transformed the library's most sophisticated security system into her personal authentication device. The Georgetown student who had mocked her library card was now hunched over his laptop, probably Googling Level 7 security clearance, and coming up with results that would make him lose sleep for weeks. The restricted collections were housed in a climate-controlled basement that required 2 separate key cards to access. The walls were lined with filing cabinets that contained documents spanning 3 centuries of American military history. Much of it was still classified, available only to researchers with the proper clearances and academic credentials. Elena moved through this space with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years in similar facilities. She knew exactly where to look, exactly which filing systems would contain the information she needed. Her hands moved over the document. Indexes with practiced efficiency, decades of training allowing her to process information at a rate that would have impressed the intelligence analysts who had once been her colleagues. Dr. Thornfield watched in fascination as Elena pulled files with surgical precision. Each document seemed to be exactly what she was looking for, as if she had some kind of internal map of the archive's contents. The stack of material she was accumulating would have taken a typical researcher months to locate, but Elena was assembling it in less than an hour. May I ask what you're researching? Dr. Thornfield ventured. Elena looked up from a file marked Classified Historical Medical Incidents. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested depths that most people would never be allowed to see. Pattern recognition, she said simply. Sometimes the past provides context for the present. She returned to her work, and Dr. Thornfield found herself standing in the presence of someone who clearly belonged in this world of classified documents and government secrets. The tired woman in the navy jacket had been replaced by someone who moved through restricted information with the confidence of someone who had spent years in places where knowledge was power and ignorance could be fatal. Elena Vasquez was finally in her element, and Dr. Thornfield was beginning to understand that they had all vastly underestimated the woman with the simple library card. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Elena spread the declassified documents across the mahogany reading table in the archive's secure study room. Each file folder bore the distinctive red stripes that marked materials requiring special handling, and the stack she'd assembled represented decades of military, medical incidents that had been buried in bureaucratic language and statistical anomalies. Dr. Thornfield had retreated to her office, leaving Elena alone with her research, but the building's security cameras tracked her every movement. 3 floors above, in the university's administrative wing, phones were ringing as word of the morning's events reached people who had spent years hoping they'd never hear Elena Vasquez's name again. The first file Elena opened contained incident reports from Walter Reed Army Medical Center, dated 18 months ago. Cardiac patients dying at rates that exceeded normal parameters. The official cause of death was listed as complications from pre-existing conditions, but Elena's trained eye caught the discrepancies immediately. The timing of the deaths, the specific medications that had been administered, the duty schedules of the nursing staff during each incident. She'd seen this pattern before. The second file was thicker, containing reports from a Navy hospital in San Diego. Similar deaths, similar circumstances, but spaced out over a longer period. The investigating officers had attributed the cluster to statistical variance, But Elena could see the signature of something far more sinister. The medications weren't just being administered incorrectly. They were being deliberately altered. Elena pulled out her phone and photographed specific pages, her movements quick and efficient. The camera's flash was disabled, a habit from years of document intelligence work where light discipline could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Each photograph was automatically encrypted and stored in a secure partition that would self-destruct if the phone fell into the wrong hands. The third file made her blood run cold. Mercy General Hospital, her hospital. The file was dated 6 months ago, buried in a routine audit that had been classified at the request of the Department of Veterans Affairs. The report documented a pattern of unexplained deaths in the cardiac wing, but it had been dismissed as coincidental. The investigating team had been reassigned before they could complete their analysis. Elena's hands moved with practiced precision as she cross-referenced the dates with her own observations. The deaths she'd noticed during her night shift rounds matched the timeline exactly. But there was something else, something that made her stomach clench with the familiar weight of operational certainty. The same signature appeared in all 3 locations. Not a person, but a method. A way of altering medications that would be undetectable to routine toxicology screens. A technique that required advanced knowledge of pharmacology and access to military-grade resources. She was looking at the work of someone who had been trained by the same people who had trained her. Elena closed the file and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't random. It wasn't even opportunistic. Someone was systematically targeting veterans receiving cardiac care at facilities across the country. The deaths were being made to look natural, but they were executions. Professional, precise, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The question was why. Elena pulled out her phone again and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Secure line, authentication required. Phoenix 77 Alpha, Elena said, reciting the code she'd hoped never to use again. Authentication confirmed. Hello, Elena. I was wondering when you'd call. Hello, Marcus. I need to talk. I figured you might. Your library card triggered some interesting alerts this morning. Half the intelligence community is wondering why you're suddenly accessing classified materials. Elena smiled grimly. Marcus. Chun had been her handler during her final operation, a man who understood the weight of secrets and the price of knowledge. If anyone would understand what she'd discovered, it would be him. I found something, Marcus. Something that connects to the old network. Hold that thought. This line isn't secure enough for what you're about to tell me. There's a coffee shop called Grind on 5th Street, 3 blocks from your current location. Meet me there in 1 hour. Come alone and Elena? Yeah? Bring everything you've found. All of it. The line went dead, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the weight of what she'd discovered. She methodically photographed the remaining documents, her movements automatic as her mind processed the implications of what she'd uncovered. Someone was hunting veterans, and they were using the same techniques that had been developed for overseas operations. Elena gathered the files and returned them to their proper locations, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who had spent years handling classified materials. Every document went back exactly where she'd found it, leaving no trace of her research except for the digital copies, stored in her phone's encrypted partition. Dr. Thornfield was waiting for her at the circulation desk, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes betraying the anxiety that had been building throughout the morning. The graduate students who had mocked Elena earlier were nowhere to be seen, probably having fled to safer parts of the library where they wouldn't risk encountering the woman who had turned their world upside down. Find what you were looking for? Doctor? Thornfield asked, her voice professionally pleasant but strained. I found what I needed, Elena replied. her tone carrying the weight of someone who had just confirmed their worst fears. "Thank you for your assistance, Dr. Thornfield. The access you provided was invaluable." "Of course. And Ms. Vasquez? If you need to return for additional research, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. We'll make sure you have whatever access you require." Elena nodded and turned toward the exit, but Dr. Thornfield's voice stopped her. "Ms. Vasquez, may I ask you something?" Elena turned back, her expression patient but guarded. "That security clearance of yours, level 7, I've never seen anything like it. What exactly did you do in the service?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focusing on something beyond the library's walls. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of experiences that most people couldn't imagine. "I kept people safe, Dr. Thornfield. Sometimes that meant gathering information. Sometimes it meant eliminating threats. And sometimes it meant making decisions that other people couldn't live with. And now I'm trying to keep people safe again. But the threats are different, and the rules have changed." Elena walked out of the library into the crisp autumn air, her mind already shifting into operational mode. The woman who had entered the building that morning as a tired hospital worker was gone, replaced by someone who had spent 2 decades in the shadows between nations, where loyalty was currency and betrayal was a death sentence. The coffee shop Marcus had mentioned was exactly where he'd said it would be, a small establishment tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner. Elena arrived 15 minutes early, automatically selecting a table near the back exit with clear sight lines to both entrances. Old habits died hard, and in her experience, they usually died hard for good reasons. Marcus arrived precisely on time, looking exactly as she remembered him. Medium height, graying hair, the kind of face that was designed to be forgotten in a crowd. He wore a business suit that was expensive enough to blend in anywhere, but not so expensive as to draw attention. The perfect camouflage for someone who had spent his career being invisible. "Elena," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "You look good. Civilian life agrees with you." "Cut the small talk, Marcus. You know why I'm here." Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Still direct. "I always appreciated that. About you. Tell me what you found." Elena pulled out her phone and showed him the encrypted files. Marcus's expression grew darker as he scrolled through the photographs, his professional calm cracking slightly with each new piece of evidence. "Jesus Christ, Elena, where did you get this?" "Whitmore University's military archives." "Someone's been busy, Marcus. 3 separate facilities, dozens of veterans dead, and it's all being made to look like natural causes. And you think this connects to the old network? I know it does. The methodology is identical to what we used in Syria. Same pharmaceutical approach, same timing patterns, same signature. Whoever's doing this was trained by our people." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that Elena recognized from their years working together. It was the tell that meant he was processing information and calculating risks. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this?" "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that comes from someone who's seen what happens to people who dig too deep into operations that were supposed to stay buried. The old network has connections everywhere. If they're behind this, and if they realize you're onto them, then you're not just putting yourself at risk. You're putting everyone you care about at risk." Elena's laugh was bitter. "Everyone I care about? Marcus, I'm a hospital janitor who lives alone in a studio apartment in the worst part of town. I don't have anyone to put at risk, don't you?" The question hung in the air between them, and Elena realized that Marcus knew something she didn't. Her mind raced through the possibilities, but before she could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. Marcus glanced at the screen, and his expression changed. "We need to go. Now. What's wrong?" Your little research session this morning triggered more than just library security protocols. Someone's been watching the Watchers, Elena, and they know you're back in the game. Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had kept her alive through countless operations. The hunt was on, and she was about to discover whether she was still the predator or if she'd become the prey. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Elena's training kicked in as she cataloged exits, potential threats, and defensive positions. Marcus was already moving, his casual demeanor replaced by the lethal efficiency that had made him one of the most effective handlers in the intelligence community. They walked out into the afternoon sun, and Elena realized that her quiet life as a hospital janitor was officially over. The woman who had tried to disappear into civilian anonymity was gone, replaced by someone who had spent 20 years in places where survival depended on being better, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else. The real game was just beginning. Walk back to Elena's apartment building felt different now, charged with the kind of tension that came from knowing you were being watched. Marcus maintained a casual pace beside her, but Elena could see the micro-adjustments in his posture, the way his eyes tracked potential threats in parked cars and doorways. They were both operating on muscle memory developed over decades of field work, their conversation light and meaningless while their minds processed the tactical situation. "Third-floor window, blue building across the street," Marcus murmured, his voice barely audible. "Telephoto lens been tracking us for 2 blocks. Elena didn't look up, but she mentally cataloged the information. Gray sedan, Missouri plates. 2 occupants, been following since we left the coffee shop. I saw them, professional, but not top tier. Probably contractors." They reached Elena's building, a 6-story brick structure that had seen better decades. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and desperation, and the elevator had been broken for so long that the maintenance company had stopped returning calls. Elena led Marcus up 3 flights of stairs, her keys already in her hand before they reached her door. Inside, the studio apartment was spartanly furnished but meticulously clean. A single bed against the far wall, a kitchenette that barely qualified as functional, and a small table that served as both desk and dining area. But Marcus's trained eye immediately noticed the details that marked it as the home of someone who had never truly left the intelligence world. The mirrors were positioned to provide sightlines to all approaches. The windows had been modified with security film that would slow down an entry team by precious seconds. The door had 3 separate locks, including a deadbolt that looked like it could stop a small tank. And most tellingly, there were no personal photographs, no decorations, nothing that couldn't be abandoned in under 60 seconds. "Elena, we need to talk about what happened at the hospital last night." Elena froze, her hand halfway to the coffee maker. "What about last night?" The patient in room 314, Samuel Rodriguez, 73 years old, Vietnam veteran, admitted for routine cardiac catheterization. He died at 3:47 a.m. during your shift. Elena's voice was carefully controlled. "People die in hospitals, Marcus. It's not exactly unusual." "No, but the timing is interesting." According to the medical records, Mr. Rodriguez was stable until approximately 3:30 a.m. Then something changed. His heart rate spiked, blood pressure dropped, and he went into cardiac arrest. The attending physician attributed it to an adverse reaction to his medication, and the medication in question was administered by a nurse who had been on duty for 16 consecutive hours. A nurse who, according to her personnel file, has a gambling problem and recently received a deposit of $50,000 into her checking account. Elena turned to face him, her expression stone cold. "You're telling me that someone got to Maria Santos?" "I'm telling you that someone knew you were getting close to something, and they decided to send you a message, Mr. Rodriguez wasn't just another victim, Elena. He was bait." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been walking the cardiac ward every night for months, documenting patterns, taking notes, gathering evidence. Someone had been watching her watch them, and they'd escalated their timeline. To draw her out, how long have you known? About the surveillance? 3 days. About the connection to the old network? I started putting it together this morning when your library card triggered the security protocols. Elena moved to the window and peered through the blinds. The gray sedan was still there, and she could see the outline of at least 2 figures. In the front seat. Professional surveillance, but not sophisticated enough to avoid detection by someone with her training. Marcus, I need you to tell me exactly what you know about the old network. Marcus sat down heavily in the apartment's single chair, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. Elena, there are things about our operations that were never in the official reports. Things that were decided at levels so high that most of us never even knew they existed. What kind of things? The kind that required people like you to do work that couldn't be traced back to official channels. The kind that involved assets who were officially dead, but continued to operate under deep cover. The kind that created legends so convincing that even their handlers sometimes forgot they were just cover stories. Elena's blood ran cold. You're talking about the Phoenix program. I'm talking about something that made the Phoenix program look like a training exercise. Elena, during your last operation in Syria, you weren't just gathering intelligence on enemy assets, you were being tested. Tested for what? For inclusion in a program that doesn't officially exist. A program that recruits people who have proven they can make impossible decisions and live with the consequences. People who can disappear so completely that even their own government forgets they exist. Elena sank onto the edge of her bed, her mind reeling. The suicide mission, the one where my entire team was killed, wasn't a suicide mission. It was a recruitment test, and you passed. I passed? Marcus, 6 people died because of intel failures. That were deliberate. Elena, your team was compromised from the beginning. The leak that led to their deaths was orchestrated by people who wanted to see how you'd react under extreme pressure. They wanted to know if you'd follow orders. When following orders meant abandoning your people. Elena's hands began to shake. And when I refused to leave them behind, you became the most valuable asset the program had ever produced. Someone who would follow orders when they made sense, but who would break them when breaking them was the right thing to do. Someone who could be trusted with operations that required moral flexibility. That's why they gave me the library card. That's why they gave you everything. The apartment, the job, the identity. Elena Vasquez, hospital janitor, was never supposed to be permanent. She was supposed to be a rest stop while you healed from Syria. But then you started noticing things at the hospital, and the people running the program realized they had a problem. Elena stood and began pacing, her mind racing through the implications. The people dying at Mercy General aren't random victims. They're veterans who know something about the program. Veterans who were involved in operations that were supposed to stay buried. Operations that would embarrass certain government officials. If they ever came to light, so they're being eliminated. Quietly, professionally, and in a way that looks completely natural. Heart attacks, strokes, medication errors. The kind of deaths that don't generate investigations or awkward questions. Elena stopped pacing and turned to face Marcus. And Maria Santos, the nurse who administered the fatal medication, is probably dead already. These people don't leave loose ends. Elena's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood turn to ice. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakable. We know you're listening. Stop digging or join your friend from room 314. Marcus looked at the message and swore under his breath. Elena, we need to get you out of here. Now. Elena's voice was sharp with resolve. I'm not running anymore, Marcus. These people killed my team. They've been killing veterans for months, and now they're threatening me directly. It's time to end this. Elena, you don't understand. The resources they have at their disposal are the same resources I was trained to use. Marcus, I spent 20 years in places where staying alive meant being better than everyone who wanted to kill me. I've survived interrogations, assassinations, and betrayals that would have broken most people. I'm not going to be intimidated by some shadow network that thinks they can clean up their mistakes by murdering veterans. Elena moved to her closet and pulled out a small duffel bag. Inside were items that definitely didn't belong to a hospital. Janitor, encrypted communication devices, tactical gear, and weapons that were both illegal and extremely effective. She'd kept them as insurance, never expecting to need them again. What are you doing? I'm going back to the hospital. If they want to send me a message, I'll send them one right back. Elena, that's suicide. No, Marcus, that's war. And it's about time someone reminded these people that some wars have consequences. Elena checked her weapons with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic and deadly. The tired hospital worker was gone, replaced by someone who had spent 2 decades in places where the only rule was survival. I need you to do something. For me, she said, not looking up from her preparations. Name it. I need you to contact every veteran who's ever worked with the program. Everyone who might be a target. I need them to know that someone's hunting them, and I need them to know that someone's fighting back. Elena, that's going to put a lot of people at risk. They're already at risk. The only question is whether they're going to die quietly or die fighting. Elena slung the duffel bag over her shoulder and headed for the door. Marcus grabbed her arm. Elena, wait. There's something else you need to know. What? The person running the elimination program. The one who's been ordering the deaths. I know who it is. Elena's eyes hardened. Tell me. It's someone you know. Someone you trusted. Someone who was supposed to be dead. Elena's mind raced through the possibilities, but before she could respond, the lights in the apartment went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, but it was too late. The building's electrical system had been compromised, and Elena could hear the sound of boots on the stairs below. They were out of time. Elena grabbed Marcus and pulled him toward the fire escape. We're leaving, now. As they climbed through the window onto the metal platform outside, Elena could hear doors being kicked in throughout the building. The elimination team had arrived, and they weren't interested in taking prisoners. Elena looked back at the apartment that had been her home for 3 years, then at Marcus, who was struggling to keep up with her pace on the fire escape. Marcus, I need you to promise me something. What? If I don't make it out of this, I need you to make sure the truth gets out. About the program, about the deaths, about everything. These people have been hiding in the shadows for too long. Elena, you're going to make it out of this. You're the best operative I've ever worked with. Elena smiled grimly as they reached the alley behind the building. I'm not an operative anymore, Marcus. I'm just someone who's tired of watching good people die for bad reasons. She could hear shouts from above as the elimination team realized their targets had escaped. There would be more teams, more attempts, more violence. But Elena was done being a victim. The hunt was on, and this time, she intended to be the one doing the hunting. The fire escape led them into an alley that reeked of garbage and broken dreams, but Elena moved through it with the fluid grace of someone who had navigated far worse terrain under hostile fire. Marcus struggled to keep pace, his desk bound. Years showing as they sprinted toward the mouth of the alley where Elena's motorcycle waited under a weathered tarp. She'd bought the bike 6 months ago, paying cash to a dealer who didn't ask questions about registration or insurance. It was a Honda Shadow, black and unremarkable, but Elena had made modifications that weren't visible to casual inspection. The engine had been tuned for maximum performance, the suspension reinforced, and the exhaust system modified to run nearly silent when necessary. It was transportation for someone who might need to disappear quickly and quietly. Get on, Elena commanded, throwing Marcus a helmet while she kicked the bike to life. The engine purred with restrained power, and she could feel the familiar weight of preparation settling over her like armor. Behind them, she could hear shouting as the elimination team realized their quarry had escaped through the buildings. Rear exit. Marcus climbed on behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist with the desperation of someone who had spent too many years behind a desk and not nearly enough time in the field. Elena gunned the engine and shot out of the alley, taking a hard right onto Madison Street and immediately blending into the early evening traffic dot in her rearview mirror. She could see black SUVs emerging from the side streets around her building. Professional vehicles with tinted windows and government plates that screamed federal agency to anyone who knew what to look for. But Elena had a head start and 20 years of experience in urban evasion. She took a series of seemingly random turns, doubling back on herself twice and using traffic patterns to mask her movement before finally pulling into the parking garage of a downtown office building. The garage was nearly empty, most of the building's occupants having gone home for the day. Elena parked the bike in a corner space that was invisible from the entrance and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, she could hear Marcus breathing heavily behind her. "Elena, where exactly are we going?" "Mercy General." "I'm going to end this tonight." "That's insane. They'll be expecting you there." Elena pulled off her helmet and turned to face him. "Marcus, they've been playing a game where they make the rules and change them whenever it suits them. Tonight, I'm changing the rules." She opened her duffel bag and began extracting equipment. A tactical vest that had saved her life in 3 different countries. Night vision goggles that could see through smoke and darkness. Communication gear that could intercept and jam most standard frequencies. And weapons. Lots of weapons. "Elena, you can't just walk into a hospital armed like you're invading a small country. I'm not walking in. I'm going to do what I should have done months ago when I first noticed the pattern. I'm going to gather evidence that can't be dismissed or buried." Elena pulled out a device that looked like a cross between a smartphone and a medical scanner. This little toy can detect pharmaceutical compounds in concentrations as low as parts per million. It can also record video and audio in complete darkness, and it transmits everything it captures to secure servers in real time. "Where did you get that?" "Same place I got everything else. The people who trained me wanted to make sure I could operate independently if necessary. They just never expected me to use their tools against them." Elena strapped on the tactical vest and checked her weapons. A Sig Sauer P320 with a suppressor, 2 spare magazines, and a combat knife that had been with her through operations on 4 continents. She'd hoped never to touch any of it again, but hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me while I'm inside." "What?" "I need you to contact Director Matthews at the Oversight Division. Tell him that Elena Vasquez is activating Protocol 7. Marcus went pale. "Elena, Protocol 7 is reserved for situations of national security. You're talking about declaring war on your own government." "I'm talking about declaring war on the people who corrupted it. There's a difference." Elena mounted the motorcycle again, but this time she was alone. Marcus climbed off, his expression a mixture of admiration and terror. "Elena, what if you're wrong? What if this is bigger than we think? Then I'll die trying to stop it." "But Marcus, I've been wrong before, and I've been right before. The difference is that when I'm wrong, only I pay the price. When I'm right and I do nothing, innocent people die." She kicked the bike to life and rode out of the garage into the Chicago night. The streets were alive with the usual urban chaos of evening traffic and pedestrian life, but Elena moved through it like a ghost. Her route planned to avoid traffic cameras and patrol areas where the elimination teams might be waiting. Mercy General Hospital loomed ahead of her like a fortress of glass and steel. 12 stories of medical facility that served the city's poorest residents. staffed by doctors and nurses who were either just starting their careers or couldn't find work anywhere else. Elena had walked these halls for 3 years, invisible in her janitorial uniform, watching and learning and documenting. Tonight, she was coming back as someone very different. Elena parked the motorcycle in the hospital's employee lot, choosing a spot near the maintenance entrance where security coverage was minimal. She'd studied the hospital's security protocols during her time there, noting the camera blind spots and shift change patterns that could be exploited by someone who knew what they were looking for. The maintenance entrance required a key card, but Elena had kept hers when she'd called in sick that morning. Officially, she was still an employee of the hospital's custodial services. Unofficially, she was about to commit several federal crimes in pursuit of evidence that could bring down a shadow network that had been operating with impunity for years. Elena slipped through the entrance and immediately moved to the service elevator that would take her to the cardiac wing. The hospital felt different at night, quieter but somehow more alive with the desperate energy of people fighting for their lives. She could hear the distant sounds of medical equipment and hushed conversations, the background soundtrack of a place where death and healing wrestled for supremacy every hour of every day. The cardiac wing was on the 7th floor, and Elena knew its layout better than most of the medical staff. She'd mopped these floors, emptied these trash cans, and observed these procedures for months. But tonight, she was seeing it through different eyes, looking for evidence of the systematic murders that had been disguised as medical care. Elena made her way to the medication storage area, a secure room where controlled substances were kept under lock and key. The room required both a key card and a biometric scanner to access, but Elena had been planning for this moment for weeks. During her time as a janitor, she'd observed the medical staff entering the room hundreds of times, memorizing their access patterns and noting the security vulnerabilities. The lock was sophisticated, but Elena had been trained by people who specialized in circumventing sophisticated locks. She attached a small device to the biometric scanner, a piece of equipment that could fool most fingerprint readers by playing back previously recorded data. The device had cost more than Elena made in 6 months as a hospital janitor, but it was worth every penny if it could provide the evidence she needed. The scanner beeped softly, and the door clicked open. Elena slipped inside and began her search, her eyes scanning the shelves of medications with the focused intensity of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. The pharmaceutical scanner in her hand detected traces of compounds that shouldn't have been present, chemical signatures that indicated tampering with standard cardiac medications. But it was what she found in the disposal unit that made her blood run cold. Vials of medication that had been emptied and refilled with substances that would cause exactly the kind of cardiac episodes she'd been documenting. The work was professional, almost artistic in its precision. Someone with advanced knowledge of pharmacology had been systematically altering medications to create untraceable murders. Elena photographed everything, her camera automatically uploading the images to secure servers that couldn't be accessed or deleted by unauthorized personnel. But as she worked, she became aware of footsteps in the corridor outside. Soft, deliberate, moving with the kind of care that suggested someone who didn't want to be heard. She killed the lights in the medication room and drew her weapon, her body automatically shifting into combat mode. Through the small window in the door, she could see a figure moving down the hallway with practiced stealth. Not hospital security, not medical staff, but someone who moved like a professional. The figure stopped outside the medication room and tried the handle. Finding it locked, they produced a device similar to the one Elena had used, but newer and more sophisticated. Elena realized she was about to meet one of the people responsible for the deaths she'd been investigating. The door clicked open, and Elena pressed herself against the wall beside the entrance. The figure entered cautiously, weapon drawn, clearly expecting to find someone inside. Elena could see enough in the dim light to make out tactical gear and body armor, the kind of equipment used by people who killed for a living. "I know you're in here, Vasquez," the figure said, voice distorted by an electronic modulator. "Why don't you come out so we can discuss this like professionals?" Elena remained silent, her weapon trained on the doorway. She could hear more footsteps. In the corridor, at least 2 more people moving into position. This wasn't a coincidence. They'd been waiting for her. "You've caused quite a stir today, Elena. First the library, then the apartment. You've got people very nervous." The figure moved deeper into the room, and Elena could see that it was a woman, approximately her own height and build. Professional. Posture, military bearing, expensive equipment. This was someone from the old network, someone who had been trained by the same people who had trained Elena. "The deaths at this hospital, Elena, they're not what you think they are." Elena's finger tightened on the trigger, but she remained silent. Information was currency in this world, and the woman seemed willing to spend some of it. The veterans who died here weren't innocent victims. They were loose ends. People who knew things that could have compromised operations that saved thousands of lives. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena stepped out of the shadows, her weapon trained on the intruder's center mass. Funny thing about the greater good. It always seems to require someone else to do the dying. The woman turned, unsurprised by Elena's appearance. In the dim light, Elena could see her face clearly for the first time, and recognition hit her like a physical blow. "Hello, Elena. It's been a long time." Elena's world tilted on its axis as she stared at the face of someone who was supposed to be dead. Someone who had died in Syria during the operation that had destroyed Elena's team and changed her life forever. "Sarah Chun, I watched you die." "No, Elena, you watched me disappear." "There's a difference." Sarah Chun had been Elena's closest friend during their time in naval intelligence, a brilliant operative who specialized in deep cover infiltration. She'd been Elena's partner on dozens of missions, the person Elena trusted more than anyone else in the world. And she died in Elena's arms during the firefight that had destroyed their entire unit, except she hadn't died at all. Elena's weapon never wavered, but her mind was reeling. How long? How long have I been alive? Since the day you left me for dead in that Syrian bunker. How long have I been with the network? Since about 30 seconds after you walked away. The revelation hit Elena like a sledgehammer. The operation that had destroyed her team, the betrayal that had led to their deaths, the intelligence failure that had cost so many lives, it had all been orchestrated by the person she'd trusted most. "You sold us out." "I saved us, Elena. The network offered me a choice. Die with the team or live to serve a higher purpose. I chose to live." Elena's voice was ice cold. "And the others, Marcus Williams Rodriguez? Did they get a choice? They were acceptable losses. The mission was more important than any individual." Elena's finger moved to the trigger, but Sarah raised her weapon as well. 2 professionals trained by the same people, facing each other across a room full of medications that had been used to kill innocent people. "Don't do this, Elena. You don't understand what you're interfering with. The network has been protecting this country for decades. We do the things that elected officials can't authorize and that history books can't record. You murder veterans in hospital beds. We eliminate security risks. There's a difference." Elena smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You know what, Sarah? You're right. There is a difference. And I'm about to show you what it looks like." The first shot shattered the silence of the cardiac wing, and Elena Vasquez disappeared back into the shadows of a war that officially didn't exist. The gunshot echoed through the medication room like thunder, but it wasn't Elena who fired first. Sarah Chun's bullets splintered the metal shelving inches from Elena's head, sending pharmaceutical bottles crashing to the floor in a cascade of glass and liquid. Elena rolled behind a heavy medicine cabinet as Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "You always were too sentimental, Elena. That's why you never made it into the inner circle." Elena's response was a precise double tap that forced Sarah to dive behind the drug dispensing unit. The tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating, and Elena could hear reinforcements moving through the hospital corridors. The network had anticipated her arrival and positioned assets throughout the building. "The patients on this floor, Sarah. Innocent people trying to recover from surgery. Are you willing to have their blood on your hands?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Innocent people? Elena, half the patients in this wing are veterans who participated in operations that would make your Syrian mission look like a training exercise. Do you know what your friend Samuel Rodriguez did in Laos? The villages he helped disappear? The children who died because of intelligence he provided?" Elena's mind raced. Sarah was trying to justify the murders by painting the victims as war criminals, but Elena had read Rodriguez's file. He'd been a communications specialist, not a combat operative. The man who died in room 314 had spent his war repairing radios and maintaining equipment. "You're lying." "Am I? Check your precious files, Elena. Really dig into the backgrounds of everyone who's died in this hospital. You might be surprised by what you find." Elena used the conversation to reposition herself, moving to a better firing angle while keeping Sarah talking. The medication room had only one exit, but Elena had noticed a ventilation grate near the ceiling that might provide an escape route if the situation became untenable. "Even if what you're saying is true, that doesn't give you the right to execute them. There are laws, Sarah. Courts, due process. Laws written by people who've never had to make the hard choices. Elena, you spent 20 years in places where the law was whatever kept you alive until tomorrow. Don't pretend you've suddenly developed a conscience." Elena's earpiece crackled to life. Marcus's voice transmitted through the encrypted communication system she'd activated before entering the hospital. "Elena, I've got bad news. Matthews at Oversight Division is compromised. When I mentioned Protocol 7, he knew details that aren't in any official database. The network has people everywhere." Elena whispered into her throat mic, "How deep does this go?" "Deeper than we thought. I'm looking at financial records that show payments to government officials, military contractors, even Supreme Court clerks. This isn't just a rogue operation, Elena. This is institutional." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd assumed the network was a small group of former operatives who'd gone rogue, but Marcus was describing something that reached into the highest levels of government. The people she'd served, the institutions she'd trusted, the very foundations of the system she'd sworn to protect, all of it was compromised. Sarah must have sensed Elena's shock because her voice took on a persuasive tone. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you, the scope of what we're dealing with? Elena, the network isn't the enemy of democracy. We are democracy. We're the people who make the decisions that elected officials can't make, who take the actions that history will never record. You're talking about a shadow government. I'm talking about the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. Do you think the threats to this country announce themselves on CNN? Do you think our enemies play by the same rules we pretend to follow?" Elena could hear footsteps in the corridor outside, at least 3 different sets moving with military precision. The reinforcements were in position, and she was trapped in a room with limited exits and dwindling ammunition. "The veterans you've been killing, Sarah. What threat did they pose? A 73-year-old man with a heart condition? A 60-year-old woman dying of cancer?" They were talking, Elena, to journalists, to congressional staffers, to their families, telling stories about operations that were supposed to stay buried, Every word they spoke was a potential security breach. Elena's anger flared. So you murdered them to keep them quiet. We silenced security threats. It's what we were trained to do. Elena made her decision. She couldn't win a firefight against superior numbers in a confined space, but she could gather the evidence needed to expose the network. The pharmaceutical scanner in her tactical vest was still recording, capturing every word of Sarah's confession. Sarah, I want you to know something. Everything you've said in the last 5 minutes has been recorded and transmitted to secure servers. Even if you kill me tonight, the truth is going to come out. The silence that followed was more frightening than the gunfire had been. Elena could practically hear Sarah's mind calculating the implications, weighing options, deciding how to minimize the damage. Elena, you don't understand what you've done. The network has resources you can't imagine. People in positions you can't touch. Even if you release those recordings, who's going to investigate? Who's going to prosecute? We have judges, prosecutors, congressional oversight committee members. The system you're trying to expose is the system that would investigate the exposure. Elena felt a chill of recognition. Sarah was right about the scope of the network's influence, but she was wrong about one thing. Elena wasn't working within the system anymore. You know what your problem is, Sarah? You've been playing in the shadows for so long that you've forgotten about the light. Elena activated a secondary protocol on her communication device, one that she'd hoped never to use. The signal went out to contacts she'd developed over 20 years of operations, people who existed outside the formal intelligence structure, journalists who specialized in government corruption, hackers who believed information should be free, veterans advocacy groups who had been fighting for transparency for decades. Within minutes, the recordings of Sarah's confession would be in the hands of people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by exposing the truth. Elena, what have you done? I've started a war, Sarah. The question is whether you want to be on the right side when it's over. The medication room door burst open, and tactical lights flooded the space. Elena could see at least 4 operators. In full combat gear, their weapons trained on her position. Professional equipment, military bearing, and the kind of coordination that came from years of working together. But Elena had spent 20 years surviving situations where the odds were stacked against her. She triggered the smoke grenades attached to her tactical vest, filling the room with dense white smoke that defeated both visual and infrared targeting systems, in the chaos that followed. Elena moved like a ghost through the pharmaceutical maze. She could hear shouted commands and the sound of equipment being overturned as the tactical team tried to locate her in the smoke. But Elena had memorized the room's layout during her months of cleaning it, and she moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where every obstacle was located. The ventilation grate was exactly where she'd remembered it, and Elena's combat knife made quick work of the mounting screws. She pulled herself into the ductwork just as the first bullets began chewing through the space where she'd been standing. The hospital's ventilation system was a maze of metal tunnels that connected every floor and wing of the building. Elena had studied the architectural plans during her time as a janitor, noting the access points and emergency exits that most people never knew existed. She crawled through the narrow passages with practiced efficiency, her tactical gear scraping against the metal walls as she made her way toward the main air handling unit. Behind her, she could hear the tactical team searching the medication room and the surrounding corridors. They would realize she'd escaped through the ventilation system soon enough, but Elena had a head start and 20 years of experience in urban evasion. Her earpiece crackled again. Marcus's voice, urgent and stressed. Elena, whatever you did worked. The recordings are spreading faster than the network can contain them. I'm seeing uploads on secure servers, encrypted file shares, even some mainstream news sites that are brave enough to run with unverified intelligence. How are they responding? Badly. I'm monitoring federal law enforcement frequencies, and there are teams being dispatched all over the city. They're trying to contain the damage, but it's too late. The cat's out of the bag. Elena reached the main air handling unit and found the access panel she'd been looking for. The unit was located in the hospital's mechanical room, a space that was rarely visited except for routine maintenance. She dropped down from the ductwork and found herself in a room filled with the machinery that kept the hospital running. But she wasn't alone. A figure stepped out of the shadows, weapon drawn but not immediately threatening. Elena recognized him. Immediately, Colonel James Harrison, her former commanding officer and the man who had recruited her into naval intelligence 25 years ago. "Hello, Elena. I was wondering when you'd find your way here." Elena's weapon was in her hand before she'd consciously decided to draw it, but Harrison made no aggressive moves. He was older than she remembered, his hair completely gray now, and his face lined with the kind of weariness that came from carrying too many secrets for too many years. "Colonel Harrison, I should have known you'd be involved in this. Should you?" "Elena, I trained you to think tactically, to see patterns, to understand the bigger picture." "What pattern do you see here?" Elena kept her weapon trained on him, but she found herself genuinely curious about his answer. Harrison had been more than a commanding officer during her early years in intelligence. He'd been a mentor, a father figure, someone she'd trusted with her life on multiple occasions. "I see a network of former intelligence operatives who've decided they know better than the people they swore to serve." Harrison smiled sadly. "You see the surface, Elena. You always were good at tactics but struggled with strategy. Let me ask you a question. In all your research, in all your investigation, did you ever wonder why the network started targeting veterans now? Why not 5 years ago or 10 years ago?" Elena hadn't considered the timing, but now that Harrison mentioned it, the pattern was recent. The deaths had all occurred within the last 18 months, because something changed. Something changed. "Elena, there's a congressional investigation coming. A real one, with subpoena power and unlimited resources. Someone leaked the existence of operations that were supposed to stay buried forever. Operations that involved activities that would destroy this country's credibility on the world stage." Elena felt the pieces clicking into place. The veterans who died weren't just random security risks. They were potential witnesses. They were people who could testify about things that would undermine 50 years of foreign policy. "Elena, do you know what would happen if the American people learned the truth about some of the operations you participated in? The governments that would fall, the allies who would abandon us, the enemies who would be emboldened." Elena's mind raced through the implications. She'd participated in operations that had involved assassinations, regime changes, and activities that violated international law. If those operations became public knowledge, the political consequences would be catastrophic. "So you decided to murder everyone who might talk. We decided to protect the greater good." "Elena, sometimes the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few." Elena's finger tightened on the trigger, but Harrison continued talking. "The recording you made of Sarah's confession. It's already spreading, but it's incomplete. It makes the network look like rogue operatives, but it doesn't explain why we felt compelled to act. Elena, if you release the full truth about the operations, about the government's involvement, about everything, you'll destroy more than just the network. You'll destroy the country we both swore to protect." Elena stared at the man who had shaped her career and her life, realizing that he was offering her a choice that would define everything that came after. "What are you asking me to do, Colonel?" "I'm asking you to walk away. Again, let the recordings stand as they are. Let the network take the fall, but don't dig deeper. Don't expose the operations that were necessary but unofficial." Elena considered his words, understanding the weight of the decision she was being asked to make. She could expose the network and become a hero to the families of the murdered veterans. Or she could expose everything and potentially destroy the country she'd spent her life serving. But as she looked at Harrison's weathered face, Elena realized there was a third option, one that neither Sarah nor Harrison had considered. "Colonel, there's something you need to understand about me. I don't make decisions based on what's politically convenient or strategically advantageous. I make decisions based on what's right." Elena's weapon never wavered as she spoke into her throat. Marcus, upload everything. All of it. Every operation, every classified file, every dirty secret. Let the American people decide what kind of country they want to live in. Harrison's face went white. "Elena, you don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing, Colonel. I'm finishing what I should have finished 20 years ago." The sound of approaching sirens filled the mechanical room, and Elena realized that her war with the network was about to become very public indeed. The sirens grew louder as Elena kept her weapon trained on Colonel Harrison, but the sound wasn't coming from police cars or ambulances. These were federal vehicles, the kind that arrived when situations had escalated beyond local law enforcement capabilities. Through the mechanical room's small window, Elena could see black SUVs surrounding the hospital, their occupants moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation. "Elena, you've triggered something you can't control," Harrison said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Those aren't rescue vehicles out there. They're containment teams." Elena's earpiece crackled with Marcus's voice, strained and urgent. "Elena, we have a problem. The file uploads are being intercepted and deleted in real time. Someone's using federal authority to shut down the servers, seize the data, and classify everything under national security provisions." Elena's jaw clenched. She'd anticipated resistance, but not the kind of institutional power that could make evidence disappear from supposedly secure servers. "How is that possible?" "Because the network goes higher than we thought. I'm looking at executive orders that were signed in the last hour, emergency classifications that grant unlimited authority to suppress information deemed threatening to national security." "Elena, they're not just covering this up. They're making it legally impossible to investigate." Harrison stepped closer, his weapon still holstered. "Elena, it's over. You fought well, but you can't win a war against the entire intelligence apparatus of the United States government." Elena's mind raced through her options. The mechanical room had limited exits, the hospital was surrounded by federal agents, and her evidence was being systematically destroyed by people with resources she couldn't match. But Elena had survived 20 years of impossible situations by refusing to accept defeat when others would have surrendered. "Marcus, what about the journalists, the advocacy groups? Contacted by federal agents and told that publishing the information would violate the Espionage Act. The ones who refused were arrested on unrelated charges." "Elena, they're not just suppressing the story, they're eliminating everyone who could tell it." Elena felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same sensation that had carried her through firefights in Syria and covert operations in places that didn't exist on official maps. She'd been in situations where every rational calculation suggested certain death, but she'd survived by finding options that others couldn't see. "Colonel, there's something you never understood about me. You trained me to follow orders, to respect authority, to work within the system. But you also trained me to survive when the system fails." Elena moved toward the mechanical room's emergency exit, a steel door that led to the hospital's loading dock. Harrison didn't try to stop her, but his expression was pained. "Elena, where are you going to go? They have your photograph, your biometrics, your complete psychological profile. Every federal database in the country is flagged with your information. You can't hide from this." "I'm not planning to hide, Colonel. I'm planning to do what I should have done years ago." Elena reached the emergency exit and paused, her hand on the door handle. Through her earpiece, she could hear Marcus coordinating with someone else. his voice too low to make out the words. But there was something different in his tone, a note of hope that hadn't been there before. "Elena, wait. There's someone here who wants to talk to you." A new voice came through the earpiece, crisp and authoritative. "Ms. Vasquez, this is Senator Patricia Walsh, Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I understand you have information about illegal activities within the intelligence community." Elena's blood ran cold. Senator Walsh was one of the most powerful people in Washington, someone with oversight authority over every intelligence agency in the government. If she was compromised, then the network's reach was even greater than Elena had imagined. "Senator, with respect, how do I know you're not part of the network?" "Because, Ms. Vasquez, I've been conducting my own investigation into the activities you've uncovered. The deaths at Mercy General Hospital are part of a pattern that extends to veteran facilities in 12 states. We've been tracking this operation for months, but we needed evidence that could survive legal challenge." Elena hesitated. Trust was a luxury she'd learned to ration carefully, and Walsh's sudden appearance felt too convenient. But the alternative was continuing to fight alone against impossible odds. "Senator, the recordings I made tonight are being suppressed by federal authority. Executive orders, national security classifications, the full weight of the system. No. I signed a counter order 30 minutes ago, using my authority as chair of the Intelligence Committee. Ms. Vasquez, your recordings are being uploaded to congressional servers that are protected by legislative privilege. They can't be classified or suppressed without explicit approval from both houses of Congress." Elena felt a spark of hope, but years of operational experience had taught her to verify everything. "How do I know this isn't another network operation?" "Because, Ms. Vasquez, I'm about to do something that will prove my commitment to exposing the truth. In 15 minutes, I'm calling an emergency session of the Intelligence Committee. The recordings you made tonight will be played in their entirety, on the record, with full congressional immunity." Elena's earpiece crackled as Marcus's voice returned. "Elena, I'm watching C-SPAN. Walsh is actually doing it. She's entering the Capitol building with a full security detail." Elena looked at Harrison, who was listening to his own communication device with an expression of growing alarm. Whatever he was hearing, it wasn't good news for the network. "Colonel, it sounds like your protection just evaporated." Harrison's shoulders sagged. "Elena, you don't understand what you've unleashed. The operations that are going to be exposed, the international consequences, the damage to relationships that took decades to build. Then maybe those relationships were built on the wrong foundation." Elena opened the emergency exit and stepped into the loading dock, where she was immediately confronted by a sight that made her question everything she thought she understood about the situation. Instead of federal agents waiting to arrest her, she found herself facing a line of men and women in military dress uniforms. Officers from every branch of the armed forces, their insignia indicating ranks from lieutenant colonel to general. At their head stood a woman Elena recognized from countless congressional hearings, General Martha Rodriguez, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "Ms. Vasquez," General Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded respect from the most powerful military in the world. "We need to talk." Elena's weapon was still in her hand, but she made no aggressive moves. The situation had shifted beyond anything she could have anticipated, and she needed information before she could determine whether these officers were allies or enemies. General Rodriguez: "I wasn't expecting a reception committee. Ms. Vasquez, the activities you've exposed tonight represent a clear and present danger to the chain of command and the constitutional authority of the United States military. The network you've been fighting has been operating without authorization from the Joint Chiefs, using resources and personnel that were never officially allocated to their operations." Elena felt the pieces clicking into place. "You're telling Me that the network has been running unauthorized operations using military assets? I'm telling you that they've been conducting acts of war against American citizens, using military techniques and equipment that were developed for foreign operations. Ms. Vasquez, what they've done isn't just murder, it's treason. General Rodriguez stepped forward, her expression grave. The recordings you made tonight provide evidence of activities that violate every oath we've taken as military officers. But we need more than recordings to bring these people to justice. We need someone who can testify about the operational details, someone who understands how the network operates from the inside. Elena realized what Rodriguez was asking. You want me to go back undercover? We want you to help us finish what you started. Ms. Vasquez, the network has cells operating in facilities across the country. Military hospitals, veteran care centers, even secure government installations. They've been using their access to eliminate potential witnesses and suppress evidence of activities that go back decades. Elena's mind raced through the implications. The network wasn't just a group of rogue operatives. It was a shadow organization that had been operating parallel to official channels for years, using military resources to conduct operations that couldn't be officially authorized. How many people are we talking about? Conservative estimate: several hundred active operatives with support networks that could include thousands of people. Ms. Vasquez, this isn't just about the veterans who died in that hospital. This is about the integrity of the entire military and intelligence apparatus. Elena heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Colonel Harrison emerging from the mechanical room, his hands raised in surrender. Behind him came Sarah Chun, escorted by 2 military police officers in full combat gear. Elena, Sarah called out, her voice carrying a note of desperation. You don't understand what you're destroying. The network exists because the official channels can't handle the threats we face. Without us, this country's vulnerable to enemies who don't play by the rules. General Rodriguez's expression hardened. Agent Chun, the United States military has been defending this country for over 2 centuries without needing unauthorized shadow operations. Your network represents everything that's wrong with the intelligence community, the arrogance to believe that you know better than the people you swore to serve. Elena looked at Sarah, seeing her former friend and partner through new eyes. The woman who had betrayed her team in Syria, who had faked her own death to join a shadow network, who had spent years murdering veterans to protect secrets that should never have existed in the first place. Sarah, I want you to know something. The operation in Syria, the one where you supposedly died, I blamed myself for years. I thought I'd failed as a leader, that I'd made tactical errors that cost my team their lives. Elena's voice was steady, but there was steel beneath the calm. Now I know the truth. You didn't die in that bunker because I made mistakes. You disappeared because you chose to betray everything we stood for. Sarah's composure finally cracked. Elena, you're making a mistake. The network offers protection, resources, the ability to make a real difference. Join us, and you can help shape operations instead of just following orders. Elena's response was immediate and final. Sarah, I've been following the wrong orders. For 20 years, it's time I started following the right ones. Elena turned to General Rodriguez. What do you need me to do? We need you to help us map the network, identify their assets, and gather evidence that will allow us to prosecute them under military law. Ms. Vasquez, you're the only person who understands their operational methods and has credibility with both the intelligence community and the veteran advocacy groups. Elena nodded slowly. General, I have one condition. Name it. The families of the veterans who were murdered deserve to know the truth. All of it, not just the parts that are politically convenient, but everything. The operations they were silenced for, the reasons they were targeted, the full scope of what was done in their names. General Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, weighing the implications of Elena's demand. Ms. Vasquez, Some of that information could compromise ongoing operations and endanger active personnel. Then maybe it's time to question whether those operations should be ongoing. Elena holstered her weapon and stepped forward, extending her hand to General Rodriguez. "General, I spent 20 years in the shadows serving the country I believed in. Tonight, I'd like to start serving the country that actually exists." General Rodriguez shook Elena's hand, and Elena realized that her war with the network was far from over. But for the first time since she'd discovered the pattern of deaths at Mercy General Hospital, she wasn't fighting alone. The real battle was just beginning, and this time, Elena Vasquez was fighting for the right side. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez stood in the witness chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing room, her right hand raised as she swore to tell the truth about operations that had been buried in classified files for decades. The ornate chamber was packed with reporters, congressional staff, and families of the murdered veterans, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation and grief that Elena carried with her every day. Senator Patricia Walsh presided over the hearing with the gravitas of someone who understood that the testimony about to be given would reshape American intelligence operations for generations. Beside her sat ranking members from both parties, their usual partisan divisions temporarily set aside in the face of revelations that had shaken the foundations of government. "Ms. Vasquez," Senator Walsh began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's sophisticated audio system. "You have served this country for over 20 years in various intelligence capacities. Can you please tell this committee what you discovered during your investigation into the deaths at Mercy General Hospital?" Elena had rehearsed this moment countless times, but sitting in the witness chair with the weight of public scrutiny upon her was different from anything she'd experienced in 2 decades of classified briefings. The families in the gallery deserved answers, and Elena was determined to provide them. "Senator, what I discovered was a systematic assassination program targeting American veterans who possessed knowledge of classified operations. These weren't isolated incidents or medical malpractice cases. They were professional executions designed to eliminate potential witnesses before a congressional investigation could compel their testimony." The murmur that ran through the chamber was immediate and intense. Elena could see reporters frantically typing on their devices, family members gripping each other's hands, and committee members exchanging glances that conveyed the magnitude of what they were hearing. "Ms. Vasquez, you've provided this committee with recordings of conversations between yourself and individuals you identify as network operatives. Can you authenticate these recordings for the record?" Elena nodded toward the large monitors positioned around the chamber. "Senator, the recordings were made using equipment that automatically encrypts and timestamps all captured audio. The authentication protocols used are the same ones employed by the National Security Agency for evidence collection and counterintelligence operations." Senator Walsh activated the playback system, and Sarah Chun's voice filled the chamber with crystal clarity. "The veterans who died here weren't innocent victims. They were loose ends. People who knew things that could have compromised operations that saved thousands of lives. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." The impact on the gallery was immediate and visceral. Elena could see Maria Santos, the widow of Samuel Rodriguez, tears streaming down her face as she heard the casual dismissal of her husband's life. Other family members sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that their loved ones had been murdered not by medical error, but by deliberate calculation. "Ms. Vasquez," came the voice of Senator James Morrison, the committee's ranking Republican member, "these recordings implicate government personnel in activities that, if true, would constitute the most serious breach of public trust in American history. What physical evidence can you provide to corroborate these allegations?" Elena had anticipated this question and had spent months working with General Rodriguez's investigation team to compile documentation that would survive legal challenge. "Senator Morrison, the committee has been provided with pharmaceutical analysis showing systematic contamination of cardiac medications at 3 separate facilities. The contamination patterns are identical, indicating a single source with access to military-grade chemical compounds. Elena gestured toward another set of monitors that displayed laboratory results in detailed technical format. Additionally, financial records show payments from offshore accounts controlled by defense contractors to medical personnel at each facility. These payments correspond directly to the timing of veteran deaths. Senator Morrison leaned forward, his expression skeptical but engaged. Ms. Vasquez, you're alleging a conspiracy that involves multiple government agencies, defense contractors, and medical facilities. Isn't it possible that you've connected unrelated incidents and created a pattern where none exists? Elena had expected this challenge and had prepared for it by working with statisticians from the Government Accountability Office. Senator, the probability of the observed pattern occurring by chance is less than 1 in 50 million. The timing, methodology, and target selection all indicate coordination by a single operational authority. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with Elena providing testimony that detailed not just the murders at Mercy General, but the broader network of operations that had been conducted without congressional oversight or executive authorization. She described training facilities that existed off the books, funding sources that bypassed normal appropriations processes, and operational methods that violated both domestic and international law. During breaks in the testimony, Elena could see the impact her words were having on the families in the gallery. Martha Rodriguez, daughter of a Navy veteran who had died at Walter Reed, approached Elena during one recess. Ms. Vasquez, my father served 3 tours in Vietnam and came home to spend 40 years as a high school teacher. He never talked about the war, but the week before he died, he told me he'd been contacted by investigators who wanted to know about something called Operation Harvest Moon. Elena's blood ran cold. Operation Harvest Moon had been a classified program from the 1960s that involved activities that would have been war crimes if they'd been conducted by anyone other than American personnel. The fact that investigators had been asking about it suggested that the congressional inquiry Senator Walsh had mentioned was broader than Elena had realized. Martha, did your father say anything else about the investigators? He said they promised him protection if he agreed to testify. He was scheduled to meet with them the day after he died. Elena realized that the network's assassination program wasn't just about covering up recent operations. It was about burying historical activities that would have exposed decades of unauthorized actions. The scope of what they were dealing with was far greater than anyone had imagined. When the hearing resumed, Elena found herself facing questions that went to the heart of American foreign policy and military operations. Senator Walsh had clearly done her homework, and her questions demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of the intelligence community's structure and operations. Ms. Vasquez, based on your experience and investigation, can you tell this committee whether the network you've described operates with or without the knowledge of senior government officials? Elena had wrestled with this question for months, weighing what she knew against what she could prove. Senator, the network operates in a gray area between official authorization and plausible deniability. Some officials know and approve, others know and choose not to interfere, and still others are kept deliberately ignorant to protect them from accountability. Can you be more specific about which officials fall into which categories? Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would end careers and potentially bring down administrations. Senator, the committee has been provided with a classified supplement to my testimony that names specific individuals and their level of involvement. What I can say publicly is that the network has operated with the knowledge and tacit approval of people at the highest levels of government. The chamber erupted in chaos as reporters shouted questions and committee members demanded immediate access to the classified supplement. Senator Walsh called for order, but Elena could see that the political implications of her testimony were already spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. During the final hour of testimony, Elena was questioned by Senator David Chun, a former military prosecutor who understood the legal complexities of intelligence operations. His questions were precise and focused on establishing criminal liability. Ms. Vasquez, in your professional opinion, do the activities you've described constitute violations of federal law? Senator Chun, the systematic murder of American citizens constitutes multiple violations of federal law, regardless of the victims' backgrounds or the perpetrator's motivations. The fact that these murders were conducted by government personnel using government resources makes them even more serious. And what about the broader network operations? The unauthorized activities, the off-books funding, the lack of congressional oversight? Elena looked directly at the families in the gallery, drawing strength from their presence. Senator, the network has operated as a government within the government, making decisions about life and death without accountability to the people they claim to serve. That's not intelligence work, that's tyranny. The hearing concluded with Senator Walsh announcing that the committee would be issuing a comprehensive report within 60 days, accompanied by criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. But Elena knew that the real work was just beginning. In the months that followed, Elena worked with federal prosecutors to build cases against network operatives across the country. Her testimony led to arrests at military facilities, defense contractors, and government agencies. The trials that resulted from her investigation would continue for years, but the immediate impact was the dismantling of an organization that had operated in the shadows for decades. Elena also worked with victim advocacy groups to ensure that the families of murdered veterans received not just justice, but support. The Vasquez Foundation, established with funding from congressional appropriations, provided counseling, legal assistance, and financial support to families who had lost loved ones to network operations. But perhaps most importantly, Elena's testimony led to fundamental reforms in the intelligence community. New oversight mechanisms were established, congressional notification requirements were strengthened, and operational authorities were clarified to prevent future abuses. 1 year after her testimony, Elena returned to Mercy General Hospital for the dedication of the Rodriguez Memorial Garden, a space created to honor the veterans who had been murdered there. Maria Santos was present for the ceremony, along with families from across the country who had lost loved ones to network operations. Elena, Maria said, embracing her in front of the memorial wall that bore her husband's name, Sam would have been proud of what you did. He always said that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when fighting seems impossible. Elena looked at the wall, which contained the names of over 200 veterans who had been murdered by the network. Each name represented not just a life lost, but a family destroyed, a community diminished, and a betrayal of the values that those veterans had fought to defend. Maria, what we did here wasn't just about justice for Sam and the others. It was about proving that the system can still work when people are willing to fight for it. As Elena walked through the memorial garden, she reflected on the path that had brought her, from a night shift janitor to a witness whose testimony had reshaped American intelligence operations. The journey had cost her everything she'd built in civilian life, but it had given her something more valuable, the knowledge that she'd finally served her country in a way that honored the oath she'd taken 25 years earlier. Elena Vasquez had never set out to be a hero or a whistleblower. She'd simply been someone who noticed a pattern that others had missed, and who refused to stay silent when silence meant more deaths. In the end, that had been enough to bring down a network that had operated with impunity for decades. The woman who had been dismissed as just a hospital janitor with a library card had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against institutional corruption is simply refusing. To look away when others prefer not to see. Elena stood before the memorial wall as the sun set over the Chicago skyline, reading the names of the veterans who had died so that others might live free from the shadows that had consumed so many lives. The granite surface reflected the last rays of sunlight, each name etched with precision and care. She traced her finger along the letters of James Morrison, a Navy SEAL who had questioned orders that seemed designed to eliminate witnesses rather than protect assets. His death had been ruled a training accident, but Elena knew better. She had seen the classified files that painted a different picture, one of systematic elimination of anyone who might expose the truth. The cold stone beneath her fingertips reminded her of the night she'd first discovered the pattern. Working late in the Veterans Hospital, emptying trash bins and mopping floors, she'd noticed medical charts that didn't match the official causes of death. Too many suicides among veterans who had shown no signs of depression. Too many accidents befalling those who had recently requested their military records. Too many families asking questions that never received answers. Their sacrifice had not been in vain, and their memory would serve as a reminder that democracy's greatest strength lies not in its institutions, but in the courage of individuals who refuse to let those institutions forget their purpose. The network was broken, but vigilance was eternal. Elena Vasquez had learned that the price of freedom was not just blood and treasure, but the willingness to stand up when standing up seemed impossible. And sometimes, that was enough to change the world. 2 years after the Senate hearings, Elena Vasquez stood in the lecture hall at the Air Force Academy, looking out at a sea of young faces that reminded her of herself at their age. The invitation to speak had come from the Academy's ethics department, part of a new curriculum designed to prevent future abuses of power within the military and intelligence communities. The auditorium was packed with nearly 300 cadets, their uniforms crisp and their faces earnest. Elena could see herself in their eager expressions, the same mixture of patriotism and naivety that had once driven her to seek ways to serve her country, even if it meant working in the shadows. She remembered the recruitment officer who had approached her during her final year of college, offering her a chance to make a difference in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. "How many of you have heard of the Vasquez protocols?" she asked the assembled cadets. Nearly every hand in the room went up. Elena smiled, remembering a time when her name had been classified and her existence officially denied. The Vasquez protocols had become standard operating procedure across all military branches and intelligence agencies, a comprehensive framework for reporting suspected misconduct without fear of retaliation. The Vasquez protocols exist because good people stayed silent when they should have spoken up. They exist because institutions can become corrupted when no one is watching. And they exist because sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to tell the truth. Elena paused, scanning the room. She could see the weight of her words settling on the young faces before her. These cadets would soon become officers, leaders responsible for the lives of the men and women under their command. The decisions they made would ripple through the military hierarchy, affecting countless lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. A young cadet in the front row raised her hand. Elena noticed the determination in her posture, the way she sat straight and made direct eye contact. "Ma'am, what advice would you give to someone who suspects wrongdoing, but isn't sure if they should report it?" Elena paused, thinking of all the people who had died because she'd initially tried to work within a system that was designed to suppress the truth. She remembered her first supervisor, Colonel Patricia Hayes, who had promised to investigate Elena's concerns about the veteran deaths. 3 weeks later, Hayes was dead, another training accident that conveniently eliminated someone who might have connected the dots. I'd tell them that uncertainty is not an excuse for inaction, that the cost of being wrong about corruption is usually far less than the cost of being right and doing nothing about it. Elena's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I'd also tell them that the system now has safeguards that didn't exist when I first discovered the pattern. The Vasquez protocols include multiple reporting channels, independent oversight, committees, and legal protections for whistleblowers that we fought hard to establish. Another cadet stood up, a young man whose nameplate read, Thompson. His voice wavered slightly as he spoke. Ms. Vasquez, do you ever regret exposing the network, the careers that were ended, the operations that were discontinued? Elena had wrestled with this question for months, especially during the trials when she'd watched former colleagues sentenced to life in prison for crimes they believed they were committing in service to their country. She thought of Director William Crawford, who had recruited her personally and who had genuinely believed that eliminating potential security risks was a patriotic duty. His final words to her before sentencing had been, "I hope you can sleep at night, knowing what you've done to this country's ability to protect itself. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the system failed so completely that ordinary citizens had to die before anyone noticed. But I don't regret speaking up, because the alternative was allowing more innocent people to be murdered in the name of national security." She looked directly at Thompson, seeing something in his expression that suggested this wasn't a hypothetical question. The hardest part wasn't facing the consequences of my actions. It was living with the knowledge that I had once been part of something that betrayed the very values I thought I was defending. The network convinced us that we were protecting America by silencing Americans. That's not protection, that's tyranny. A cadet near the back raised her hand. How do we know when we're crossing the line from protecting national security to betraying it? Elena considered the question carefully. When you find yourself asking whether the American people deserve to know the truth about their government's actions, you've found your answer. Democracy can survive threats from foreign enemies, but it cannot survive when its own institutions become the enemy of truth and accountability. After the lecture, Elena walked across the academy grounds to the newly constructed memorial to unknown veterans. The memorial honored service members whose contributions couldn't be publicly acknowledged, but whose sacrifices had protected the country in ways that would never be recorded in history books. The memorial itself was a work of art, a series of interconnected bronze sculptures that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Each figure represented a different aspect of service: the intelligence analyst who uncovered terrorist plots, the special operations soldier who rescued hostages, the linguist who decoded enemy communications. But at the center of it all stood a figure with empty hands, representing those who had served by speaking truth to power. At the center of the memorial stood a simple bronze plaque with an inscription that Elena had helped to write, in memory of those who served in silence, and in honor of those who broke that silence when silence became complicity. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, who now ran the Congressional Oversight Office for Intelligence Operations. Marcus had been her first ally in Congress, the only senator who had believed her story when she'd first approached him. With evidence of the network, he'd risked his own career to hold the initial hearings, facing accusations of being unpatriotic and soft on terrorism. "Elena, we've got a situation developing at a VA hospital in Phoenix. Same pattern, different players. Are you available?" Elena looked at the message and smiled. The network had been broken, but the work of protecting veterans and holding the intelligence community accountable was ongoing. She'd found her calling not in the shadows of covert operations, but in the bright light of public accountability. She typed back, "On my way." As Elena walked toward the parking lot where her motorcycle waited, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a dismissed hospital janitor to one of the most recognized voices in government accountability. The path had been difficult, dangerous, and sometimes lonely, but it had been worth it. The motorcycle, a restored Harley-Davidson Softail, had been a gift from her brother Miguel after the trials ended. He'd told her she needed something that represented freedom, something that would remind her that she was no longer trapped in the shadows of a system that had tried to erase her existence. The bike had become her symbol of independence, her way of moving through the world on her own terms. Elena had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent when silence serves the powerful at the expense of the powerless. That democracy's greatest strength lies not in its institutions, but in the willingness of ordinary people to hold those institutions accountable. The woman who had once been erased from official records was now teaching the next generation of military leaders about the importance of moral courage. The janitor whose library card had triggered alarms throughout the intelligence community was now the person those same agencies called when they needed to investigate potential abuses. The ride to Phoenix would take her through the same desert landscapes where she'd once operated in the shadows. But now she was traveling toward the light, toward transparency, toward a future where the phrase national security could never again be used to justify the murder of innocent people. Elena Vasquez had found her true mission, ensuring that the people who serve their country in uniform never again have to fear their own government. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments about a time when you witnessed something that didn't seem right, or when you had to make a difficult choice between staying silent and speaking up. Your experiences matter, and your voice can make a difference. Elena's story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite that fear when doing what's right matters more than personal safety. Sometimes the most unlikely people become the heroes we need, simply by refusing to look away when others prefer not to see. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes that truth and accountability still matter. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Valor, where we tell the stories of real people who chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and service over self-interest. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought not by generals or politicians, but by people like Elena Vasquez, and maybe, when the moment comes, by people like you. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, democracy depends on people who refuse to stay silent when silence serves only the powerful.